morning, everyone. I'm very impressed to see people here this morning, especially I found the room too, so that's a beginning. My name is Kathleen Stevens. I'm the president of the Korea Economic Institute of America. My nameplate is Stanford University, formerly of Stanford. It's my first time at an ISA conference. I'm thrilled to be here and to lead this panel, which I think is going to be really interesting. I'm going to introduce very briefly the panelists here, with particular thanks to Professor Gil Rozman, Princeton University emeritus professor, who's done a lot of work to organize the subject in the panel, and our other colleagues in just a moment. One reason I've never been to one of these conferences is because my background is actually not in academia. It's in diplomacy. This is kind of a second career for me to try to think about what I was trying to do all those years. And one thing I'm struck by is the title of this panel, which I confess I didn't make: Sharp Power and Value Diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. There are all three phrases there: sharp power, value diplomacy, and Indo-Pacific are ones that were unknown to me at the beginning of my career and through most of my career in Asia. But I think they're very relevant, which is why I'm excited about this panel and about some of the thinking we're going to try to do and share and provoke in the next hour or so. So as I mentioned, Professor Rozman has been the catalyst for this project, and we thank him very much for that. And we'll make the first presentation focusing on the U.S. Professor Kim Taehwan from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. I should add, everyone here has multiple affiliations and backgrounds, and I'm not going to recite that because that would take all the time. But we're very pleased to have him here to look in particular at issues related to the Korean Peninsula, in particular South Korea. Professor Takako Hikotani from Columbia University, looking at, in particular, the Japan angle, if I can call it that. Professor John Fitzgerald from Swinburne University of Technology in Australia, coming all the way from Australia. I think you get the prize for coming the furthest. I'm not sure about that, but thank you. Again, looking at Australia's important role and perspective as it looks to Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And finally, but not least, Professor Aram from New York University, who has some really interesting perspectives on North Korean power, sharp, soft, hard, and all the rest. So I think without further ado, I will ask each panelist to make their initial presentations. There's a series of very good papers underlying this, which they've prepared. I'm going to ask you, I think this is traditional, these things, right, to try to confine your comments to about 10 minutes or so. After that, I'll make a few comments, a few questions, and then we'll open it up to a general discussion. So, Professor Rozman.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for chairing this. I'm just delighted with the papers that I've seen by my colleagues, and I think we're going to have a fascinating discussion based on them. Sharp power is what is now being discussed regarding China a great deal, and values diplomacy is where the U.S. has its tradition, and I think we're going to anticipate, at least that's the challenge here, the backlash against Xi Jinping's sort of makeover of China, reducing the impact of soft power in recent time, and Donald Trump's makeover of the United States. So I expect some kind of clash of national identities to emerge with the more idiosyncratic phase of today to change in some significant way. So we talk about the China dream, and it benefited from the period where Hu Jintao raised the notion of harmonious China, but it's become tarnished in the international literature lately as a kind of China nightmare of stooping to any means to steal secrets and undermine other states. And of course, we've talked for ages about the beacon on the hill, but that's been sullied by the notion of sort of valueless, selfish America first, not able to champion democracy or even truth. Trump may be seen as sui generis, and so maybe there'll be someone else who turns it around. Whether Xi Jinping can make a shift from sharp power to more soft power is a question that we can still deal with. So when we think of Obama, we can think of someone who really wanted soft power, and even Hillary Clinton, as his Secretary of State, talked about improving soft power by making it smart power. And then we think of Hu Jintao in his first years, sort of maximizing China's soft power, and things have changed. So two things that help us understand that change are the Confucian values versus Confucian institutes theme. And here we have Confucian values, particularly in the literature on Confucian capitalism in the 1980s and 90s, talked about passion for education, meritocracy, family values, hard work, entrepreneurship, all rooted in this special Confucian tradition. And then we talk about Confucian institutes now being linked to censorship or propaganda, taking advantage of open academic environments, and they're not the cause of, but they're somehow totally, something you can't totally divorce from, the sort of atmosphere of trying to steal sensitive research secrets and creating an atmosphere favorable towards sharp power. So my overall I also mentioned we have to think of this in terms of the parallels with the Cold War. So that's the second background feature. China has insisted it's not exporting ideology, doesn't have anything to do with that, although I don't think that is correct. The U.S. has yet to clarify what it means by our new potentially ideological theme for the Asia-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific, still left rather vague, begun with under Abe in Japan. So that's something we have to think about in the context of, will we have a parallel to the Cold War in an ideological sense? So what I've done in my presentation on paper is to review thinking about sharp power and values diplomacy, discuss the impact of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, and then gone forward to talk about what the backlash may be ahead with my own specificity about some themes of national identity that I've been working on for some time. First, people are constantly wondering, what is Chinese sharp power versus Russian sharp power? Both utilize sharp power to interfere in politics and undermine institutions of democracies. They both are interested in weakening the liberal international order, but they have different long-term goals, strategic positions, methodologies, capabilities, and I posted some papers related to that in the ASEAN Forum, including one by John Fitzgerald, about, and Laura Rosenberg and John Garneau brought up some of the comparative themes. They argue that China's approach is more subtle and methodological with a longer time frame. They have a more elaborate network of proxies and front organizations. And I would add, they leave some more room for soft power. Russia is just so abrupt, so harsh, that soft power doesn't really enter into it. John, in what he wrote, talked about a shift in the intrusiveness of Chinese interference over time, rather limited in the late 90s, more active from the late 2000s, and with really unquestioned intensity of late. Through the reorganization of United Front activities, through new organizational mechanisms, and sort of involving all kinds of ministries and agencies, giving rewards, such as access for conformity, and actively supporting China. One can trace the history of what might become sharp power, or at least the ideological foundation for it, to Confucius's discussion of the rectification of names. One of the first things one learns in the study of Chinese history, how important it is what words you use. Then we can focus on Mao, or first we had Stalin developing propaganda and ideology in a very elaborate way. Then we had Mao's Yan'an Yan'an rectification campaign, where he intensified focus on language and the thought reform efforts of the 1950s. The response to Khrushchev, much of which was not just about the great power theme, but the ideological theme. He was abandoning what Mao regarded as critical to Chinese ideology. Indeed, when I was working on the Chinese debate on the Soviet Union in the mid-'80s, I was struck by how insistent, even in a reform era, Chinese sources were on condemning Khrushchev. And then it extended into the condemnation of Gorbachev, not just for his foreign policy and some of his reforms, but for his treatment of ideology. It mattered a great deal, even as some people were saying, well, China's becoming ideological free. That wasn't really the case. And I think in the U.S. case, we had the effort to intensify soft power under George W. Bush, but really it was undermined soft power because of the way it was presented. And the U.S. lost a lot of global prestige, and I think it was a counterproductive use of values. And then Obama brought it back in a big way, and then we've lost that emphasis. So what are the prospects now? I think that China still has the potential for some soft power. When they have conveyed their soft power message, they've said, we mind our own business, we don't spread ideology, we don't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, we rely on economic ties and promise a win-win outcome. There is something there that could be built on. And in the U.S. case, I think that we have a very deep foundation for coming back to soft power, but recognizing, I hope, that we can't press it on others who don't accept some of the claims we make. We have to do it in a more subtle, careful fashion than happened sometime in our recent history. So I would argue that even before Donald Trump took office, values diplomacy was failing to have an intended effect in China, in Russia, and some other countries. The explanation, I think, can be found both in the way each has reconstructed national identity to make it more impervious and to control contradictory information, and in the self-inflicted damage already occurring to U.S. national identity by our politics especially. So I would draw the conclusion that there will be an ideological Cold War between China and the United States. No matter how we work out the economics, whether there is some geopolitical understanding seems pretty doubtful. I don't see any reason to doubt that we're going to have two great powers, seen as superpowers, that differ on ideology. And for China, that will become more explicit. They will have to come back to a fuller statement of ideology. But that for the moment, the challenge is more Chinese sharp power than soft power. And one has to face that and manage that before while we're preparing for the long-term conflict.
Thank you, Gil. This may be unconventional, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. I know in your paper, I thought you had a very good definition, and several of you had a definition of sharp power. But I mean, for our audience, because we've gone through soft power and hard power over the years, and smart power was something Hillary Clinton really liked. I'm not going to do this to all of you, but I mean, could you, since sharp power is one of the things,
please do so. Yeah.
Could you sort
John,
of?
do you want to?
In the Australian debate, it's come to mean the exercise of soft power through coercive was the 3 C's.
Right.
Through coercive, is it clandestine, or anyway, through inappropriate or corrupt.
Corrupt.
I think it was, yes,
The
corrupt,
4 Cs now,
coercive,
yeah.
and covert. That's correct. The understanding being that it's an attempt to secure comparable advantage to soft power, but not using open and transparent means to do so.
Or maybe to put it another way, it's a way of achieving some of the aims of hard power, but absent traditional military force. So unconventional war, but anyway, just as a background. Thank you very much. All right, Professor Kim.
Well, thank you very much. My topic of my presentation will be China's sharp power and South Korea's peace initiative as a value diplomacy. So, given the limited time, I just would like to address three points. The first, I want to make a couple points on China's sharp power, and the second point is the third case, the third dispute between Beijing and Seoul, which lasted almost like 2 years between 2016 and 2017, which I think manifest China's sharp power. And the third point is Korea's peace initiative as a response to China's sharp offensive. That's the entire skeletal structure of presentation. Just a couple points about the sharp power definitions. Okay, yeah. But my first point on sharp power is, of course, I do have my own definition of sharp power, but I just don't intend to introduce my own definition of sharp power to complicate the bad things worse. The first point is it's really tricky and blurry. Make a clear distinction between soft power and sharp power. The first reason is that it's relative notion. For a group of countries, soft power could be, for a group of countries, what is considered as soft power could be a sharp power for another group of countries. Say, for example, liberal democracy appears to be an obvious soft power for liberal democratic countries, but then many non-liberal democratic countries, it could be pose a dangerous threat to the political regimes. In that sense, it could be sharp power. That's the first reason. More important thing that makes the distinction really blurry is the fact that both sharp and soft power, they utilize the same power resources or assets, if you like, such as values, strategic narratives, or culture, media, diaspora, precisely the same strategies, same assets. Okay, so although not explicitly written in my paper, I'm currently thinking of kind of two criteria to distinguish sharp and soft power. The first one is how to employ and implement those assets, soft power assets, cultural assets, media assets, diaspora assets. Is it employed in transparent ways or non-transparent ways? Covert ways or overt ways. That's one criteria. Another criteria is it's employed with what intended effect in mind. Okay, is it intended to attract people's hearts and minds, or is it intended to distract, divide, manipulate people's mind? So, depending along those two criteria, we could have probably 2x2 matrix, but then still we have two cells, a clear case of soft power, clear case of sharp power, but then the remaining two cells I would call a gray areas. Okay, so it really depends on case to case. That's my first point. The second point on sharp power, China is really good, even innovative in combining and hard and soft power assets to distract, divide, and manipulate to exalt political influence and pressure. Okay, that's obviously the fact that I found. And then, more important thing, the fact is that the sharpness of China's power, and to put more broadly, the increasing assertiveness of China's foreign behavior these days has been increasingly driving what I call global blockization of values. In the post-Cold War era, China pushing for blockization of values between liberalist bloc on the one hand and counter-liberalist bloc on the other hand. But unlike in the Cold War era, I mean, I have a little bit different opinion from Gil. Gil mentioned the ideological Cold War between China and the United States, but it's my term blockization is way more complicated. Why? Because the liberalist camp, although historically led by the United States, and these days joined by Japan, Australia, I mean, prime examples of liberalist representative countries. But then liberalist bloc is faced with the very daunting, grave challenges from within in the form of the rising, right populism, the far right nationalist populism, white supremacist nationalism, not only nationalism, it's sort of like the unfolding of exclusionary identity politics within the liberalist bloc, which is premised on national identity, exclusionary national identities, but also such primal identities as race, ethnicity, religion, sectarianism, sort of things. Okay, so in a sense, the challenge from within is really grave within the liberalist bloc. On the other hand, then the counter-liberalist bloc, of course, the China and Russia are leading their own version of value diplomacy. I would argue that value diplomacy is not monopolized, exclusively monopolized by the United States or liberalist countries. China, okay, the China dream or the notion of Confucius Chenxia, the heaven, all under heaven sort of things, okay. Russia, the Eurasianism, okay. So they do have their own version of value diplomacy, and they're leading actually counter-liberalist value bloc. And many developing countries and many authoritarian countries, and also as well as the BRICS countries, they're actually concurring with the China and Russia in their values. Okay? Even within the liberalist bloc, many far right populist political forces, they're also joining. Forces together with the Russian Eurasianism. Okay, so when I say blockization of values, there is no clear-cut fault line between liberalism and counter-liberalism. It is more, I would say, that a very scattered confrontations between national and primal identities. Okay, and China is not the sole driver in this blockization of global blockization of values, but then there's no doubt that China is one of the prime facilitator of increasing, growing global blockization of values. Okay, that's my first point. Third dispute. Okay, I just draw 4 points which I believe confirms the sharpness of China's power. The first point is that China utilizes asymmetric economic interdependence with South Korea, okay, as a means of political pressure in the form of unofficial economic sanctions as a retaliatory measures against South Korean deployment of the THAAD batteries. That's first point. Okay? So we clearly see a combination of hard and sharp power in the third case. Okay. The second point is China exploited divided views within South Korea between South Korean conservatives and South Korean progressives on the THAAD deployment. Okay. For the 2 years, South Korean public opinion, particularly in the intellectual circle, was clearly divided. Pro-THAAD deployment, anti-South deployment, and the pro-South deployment usually labeled as conservatives and pro-American, and anti-South deployment forces considered pro-Chinese and progressives. Okay. China utilized the internal division. In that sense, it's again clearly demonstrate the sharpness of China's involvement, political pressure. The third point is China actually retaliating exclusively against South Korea, not targeting it to the United States. Although the decision to deploy the South deployment was a joint decision made by South Korea and the United States, but then the targetable attack was exclusively at the South Korea. By doing this, China actually intended to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea, or for that matter, with the hope of weakening at least the South Korea, Korea-U.S. military alliance. The first point is that China mobilized, or rather stoked, China's own nationalists. There appears to be some, circular effects reinforcing each other between China, Beijing's unofficial economic sanctions against South Korea, and China's media's negative coverage of the issue, and also deteriorating public perception, Chinese people's public perception on South Korea. Okay. The South case clearly revealed a discrepancy between China's rhetoric and its own deeds. What is China's rhetoric? That includes like the so-called 친성해용, the amity as its policies toward neighboring countries. The four principles: the amity, sincerity, mutual benefit, and inclusion, as well as the community of common destiny. Okay? That's the principles in that rhetoric for neighboring countries. But then once the Chinese leadership decided arbitrarily, subjectively, its core national interests are at stake, then those rhetorical principles are simply gone. My final point, because time is short, I just want to make the couple points. The first point is that the Moon Jae-in administration, in the tradition of Korea's progressive administrations, embraced the peace as the utmost value to pursue in its foreign policy. That's well, actually I have set up a couple dimensions for value diplomacy. The first one is the values pursued in a country's foreign policy should be embedded in the country's national identity. Very important elements of national identity. In that sense, South Korea obviously has divided national identity since the end of World War II. But then in the tradition of progressive administration, the Moon Jae-in administration embraces the peace as the most value. And the second dimension of value diplomacy is a specific role to implement, to support the values reflected in foreign policy. What kind of roles should we play to fulfill the values manifested in foreign policy? So South Korea's role in at least three areas. The first one is the role of striking a balance between the United States and China. What is usually called the role of balanced diplomacy between two great powers. That's first role. The second role is peacemaking on the Korean Peninsula through very intensive inter-Korean reconciliation and cooperation. The third role, well known as the role of intermediating the Pyongyang and the Washington, although the last round of North Washington Pyongyang summit ended up being a grand failure. I think I should stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, we'll turn now to Professor Hikotani.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here. It's nice to travel here and to discuss with all of you about this important topic. I came into Toronto Airport late last night, and at immigration, the immigration officer asked me, "What are you here for?" And I said, I say, he said, "So how many minutes are you going to speak? 10 minutes, 12 minutes, or 15 minutes?" And that was really funny. So I guess that's around, like, we're supposed to speak 10, 12, or 15?
Yeah, that's the leading edge of sharp powers.
But anyway, that's just yesterday. But today I will talk about China's sharp power and value diplomacy in Japan. And I'll put towards Asia in a parenthesis for one thing, and talk more about the value diplomacy part than the sharp power, because one of the findings is that there isn't the type of response that you find in Australia or South Korea quite yet. I'll explore the reason why. And I need to mention that the value diplomacy part is coming out of a joint project with a co-authored piece with Amiko Nobori, who's a scholar who's at Columbia right now. So I would like to do this as a co-authorship. So what I say today, unfortunately, she couldn't make it today, but it's a result of our combined work. I'd like to make 3 points today. One, well, first, it seems that Japan has been turning more value-oriented in its diplomacy. In the current Abe administration, there's mentioning of the free and open Indo-Pacific. It calls for maintaining fundamental principles of the international order, which are the foundation of peace and stability in the Pacific. So there's a lot of language like that. And more interestingly, in the January speech by Foreign Minister Kono at the beginning of the July session, there is a foreign affairs speech. He mentioned that there's a need to continue to protect the international order based on universal values such as human rights, rule of law, and international law. He went on to say that as countries' economy develop, the people of the country will seek democracy. That is what I believe in. However, compared with the worldwide economic development we see today, there seems to be much delay on the democratization front. We need to stand firm to fight against movements to create an order that competes with the international order based on these universal values, which I thought was very different from what I saw before. So today I'd like to make 3 points. One, it's not that Japan was ever value devoid, but had different values. And I like to define what I mean by value diplomacy. There was a lot of definitions of sharp power, so I'm going to skip that and rely on others and talk about what is meant, what I mean, or what our Amiko and our working definition of value diplomacy is. Because I think there's a slight difference with soft power, and I think that's important. Two, I argue that Japan's turn to universalistic values, democracy, and human rights preceded the rise of China or China's sharp power. So it's due to a different dynamics. And it's still somewhat different in its approach from the Western countries with regard especially to democracy promotion issues, and I talk about that. Third, this is still something that is a work in process, but I argue that Japan's response to China's sharp power is slightly different from other countries, is that there isn't that much of a reaction that you might expect from the Confucius institutes that are established in Japan. There's 14 at university level, 8 at high school and lower level, but there hasn't been the type of backlash or discussions that take place in the United States. I'm based in the US right now, and I was in Japan last week to talk about that because I had a very difficult time looking for any mentioning of these institutes and why that was the case. Two, sensitive groups that are sensitive to China's sharp power tends to be more conservatively oriented, which tends to go against, or it tends to alienate the human rights groups that existed prior to, making it difficult. It seems to be more of anti-China groups that are grasping the agenda of sharp power. And so that creates a different domestic politics dynamics maybe from other countries. And third, Japan's response to China's sharp power has a lot to do with how the US is responding to China's sharp power, more so than Japan inherently. And that's been sort of a continuing pattern with regards to Japan's value diplomacy, but it's prevalent today. So first, what do I mean by saying Japan was never quite value devoid, but had different values? First, I'd like to talk about my definition of value diplomacy. I mentioned I'm doing a joint project with Amiko, my friend, but it's part of a joint project organized by Andy Nathan, who's at Columbia University, and our working definition is for value diplomacy is intentional and explicit promotion as a component of a country's foreign policy of specific values or norms for their claimed relevance to either the international order or the domestic arrangements of other states. So it's a narrower concept than soft power, which is the ability to affect others by attraction and persuasion rather than through the hard power of coercion and payment. In the sense that value diplomacy is not image promotion and not inherent attractiveness of a nation's model. So, for instance, sending Louis Armstrong to Paris is soft power, issuing a foreign ministry statement condemning a human rights abuse in another country as a violation of international standards is value diplomacy. Welcoming foreign students to study in universities is soft power, but democracy promotion is value diplomacy. So value diplomacy entails a proactive effort to promulgate a certain model for other countries to adopt. So from this perspective, Japan, while it believed in democracy and human rights for its own country, it did not engage in value diplomacy in Asia, in a sense that you might imagine, to actively promote democracy and human rights during the Cold War period. However, this does not mean that there was no value aspect to Japan's diplomacy. Instead, according to the scholar Taizo Miyagi, Japan attempted to promote the value of growth and development in the region, and that was the thrust of what was meant. Oh, it was not explicit, it was not imposing, but it wasn't that the value wasn't there, it was that it was about more growth and development. Why? First, Japanese policymakers thought that a source of spread of communism comes more from poverty and not ideology. And Japan's role was to help stability and development by offering more on financial support. Second, Japan was hesitant to be seen as to be promoting some kind of order in Asia due to its history before World War II. So they didn't want to be looking as if there's a model that they're trying to export. The third aspect, which kind of continues today, is the domestic politics of it. As many of you know, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is more conservative, was in power for the most of the Japanese post-war history. And the opposition parties to the LDP tended to be supportive of democratization efforts in countries in Asia and critical of LDP on history and human rights. So in a way, LDP was in a difficult spot when it comes to democratization efforts in rest of Asia. And I think the Cold War era, Japan's approach to diplomacy towards Asia and the value aspect of it is encapsulated in the Fukuda Doctrine by Prime Minister Fukuda in 1977, that it was to refrain from becoming a military power, pursue heart-to-heart relationships of mutual trust in various fields, seek solidarity with ASEAN on the basis of equal partnership, and pursue mutual understanding with these countries in the region. So in a way, the value was more development-oriented. It was more a mutual equal partnership, and that was considered to be the value in the diplomacy. So it was not promoting or promulgating a value. So in a way, you can argue there wasn't, but in a way, another way to put it is that it wasn't the way other Western countries tended to see. So, however, there were a couple of turning points, and I mentioned preceding the rise of China, that led to Japan's gradual turn to universalistic type of value diplomacy. And there's a couple of turning points that Amiko and I are trying to work through right now. First is basically what happened at the end of the Cold War. And one, you can argue, is we can see the mentioning of Japan's values to be more universalistically oriented, starting from the 80s, when there was a rise of Japan's calls in the literature about how Japan is different from the Western countries, especially in the areas of trade and individualism. I went to grad school long ago enough that I remember how Japan was considered different, and it was a challenge because Japan has a fundamentally different system. And with that debate being prevalent, there was an understanding within the foreign ministry that Japan needs to show that they're actually part of the same type of order, that there has to be an extra effort to show that, especially with the end of the Cold War, where it was not really clear where Japan sits on the spectrum of whether you have similar values to it or not. That's one. And the other is a certain level of backlash Japan experienced after the Tiananmen Square incident, where Japan restarted its aid to China much earlier than other Western countries. Of course, there were nuances in the policies of other Western countries as well, but Japan seemed to be less sensitive to human rights issues, and then it had to revalue what it meant by human rights and what kind of policy they should pursue. Third is the Gulf War. People talk about the Gulf trauma. It's usually not linked to the value diplomacy aspect, but once again, this would sort of ask the question of which side Japan is on and what Japan is going to do. And that led to some debates about being more explicit about what kind of values Japan stands by. And finally, this is sort of a recurring theme. It was a U.S.-Japan alliance, which kind of lost its cause or reason from having a common threat, and there was more search of a common value. And whatever that meant, if you look at statements, bilateral statements between U.S. and Japan, in the Bush administration, Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, there's always some kind of mentioning of a common values tying the two countries together. What exactly that's supposed to mean became issues. So this is more in terms of what they were saying they're pursuing. Was there a change in substance? Well, this is still within the realm of what they're saying, but there are some mentioning in the official documents that do show a change in policy. In the 1992 Official Development Assistance Charter, one of the key points, 4 key points that was mentioned in 4 important goals of ODA is to attention to recipient accomplishments in democratizing, establishing market-oriented economic system, is assuring basic human rights and freedoms. That did not exist as part of the ODA Charter prior to that. And similar wording can be seen in the MOFA Partnership for Democratic Development in 1996 and Koizumi's Initiative for Development of the Economies of Asia in 2002. Why do I highlight that? I highlighted this precursor because people tend to point to the first Abe administration as sort of a start of value diplomacy. I like to argue that it preceded, but it kind of changed its tone since what I call Abe 1.0 in 2006-2007, partly because the thrust of the argument became not just trying to belong to more the Western universalist camp, but was part of the emotional aspect to it, that is, why not become more proud of Japan's democracy and let's be explicit about it. And so in a way, it has a sort of a different thrust to promoting that than saying that we want to make sure that we're considered to be one side or the other. So the most famous one is a speech by Foreign Minister also in 2007, which talked about arch of freedom and prosperity, and the confluence of the 2 C's speech by Prime Minister Abe, saying that Japan is going to pursue arch of freedom and prosperity in the region. But in a way, it was criticized at that time to be anti-China because it wasn't sort of a understanding as it is right now about the value aspect of China's rise. And also due to the fact that Prime Minister Abe's term ended just after 1 year, it kind of died down for a while. So what do we see now in what I call Abe 2.0? I think there's more careful approach in the rhetoric, and there's still little change in the substance. And what I mean by that, first, there's a couple of documents that show the new approach. One famous one is the speech by Prime Minister Abe at CSIS in 2013 called Japan is Back. It's considered to be a speech that is just him saying that I'm back, or Japan is back. But if you look at it, it's interesting because what he's saying is that Japan is back in 3 areas. One, first, Japan must remain a leading promoter of rules. Second, a guardian of global commons. And third, work even more closely with the United States, South Korea, Australia, and other like-minded democracies throughout the region. So it's not just Japan is back and I'm back, but it's actually kind of going back into the agenda of being more on the side of the universalistic values. And what is more clear is in a national security strategy in 2013, which was the first time there was an explicit longer national security strategy than one preceded that, which continued since 50s is that there's a statement in there that says, as an advanced liberal democratic nation based on the principle of human security, Japan will actively utilize its ODA in supporting democratization, development of legal systems, and human rights, and contribute to the enhancement of the growing international trend towards the protection of human rights, including through dialogues in the area of human rights. And this has been enshrined in a new development cooperation charter, a charter that was issued in 2015. Still, I would argue, though, beyond the rhetoric, past tendencies about and how past approaches to value diplomacy do continue. First, let me highlight what was the rest of the Kono speech that I mentioned. He says in the same speech, actually, the third paragraph following the two that I introduced, is that at the same time, we know that not all countries follow the same path towards democratization. Each country should have their own way, their own speed. As we support democratization in these countries, we seek not to impose, but to try to be by their side. So I think there's still sort of more remnants of the Fukuda doctrine type of approach, even if there is a more explicit understanding that maybe Japan has to be on the side of democratization. This type of consideration is also seen in what is the most latest version of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs free and open Indo-Pacific vision. There has been different versions or updated versions of the free and open Indo-Pacific. In the most recent one, there's interesting additions in italics in a sort of a softer tone that says, with the spirit of respecting ownership of recipient countries and local people, growing and developing together. And so in a way, it's a lot less pushy, maybe, than you might expect in the tone that is presenting by promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific. And thirdly, I think it's important to note that the substance of part of it, what exactly does Japan do to promote democracy and human rights? Michael Ichihara, from Hitotsubashi University, who's much more an expert on this than I am, have shown that Japan, if you look at the spending that goes to these kind of efforts, Japan spends a lot more on public sector policy, administrative management, and legal and judicial development than democratic participation, civil society, election, and human rights. So although there has been more of a focus on promoting universalistic values in Asia, its approach has been slightly different from other Western countries and still does continue the history of Japan's policy towards the region. One example that is highlighted in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific is legal system reform in Vietnam, and it's more capacity building. So there has been criticism towards Japan that maybe Japan is simply straightening the hand of a strong leader, that maybe their approach is not necessarily democratic. I think that does represent how Japan tends to think about how democratization takes place. It's not really necessarily development before democracy, but there is a strong notion that good governance has to go together with democratization for it to be successful. Also, there is an understanding that maybe it takes much longer for a country to democratize than other Western countries might expect, and that maybe punitive measures in form of sanctions might not necessarily be helpful. So altogether, I think there are more remnants of the past in Japan's approach to value diplomacy than what the slogans might suggest. So therefore, to sum up this section, the turn to values was triggered not only to initially to show the flag in a way, to show that Japan was on the universal side, but also the added aspect of it is sort of a sense of national pride to say that it has been democratic for a long time. So that kind of created a slightly different pitch to that, especially during the Abe administration. But I think Japan is still careful not to antagonize China or to antagonize some countries who are not necessarily democratic in Asia, and has more of an inclusive approach to things. So given all this, what is Japan's response to China's sharp power? And so connecting the sharp power and the value diplomacy in my paper has been very difficult, partly because the value diplomacy has developed sort of independent of what we see in China, what we see as China's sharp power, and also because we haven't been seeing this type of response that we see in other countries with regards to Confucius Institute. As I said, there's 14 university-based Confucius Institutes in Japan, including Waseda University, it's Meika University, and there's 8 others at the high school level. But I've been looking at coverage of that, and there has been a type of criticism or of sense of threat, as we see in the Western media, in the United States and in Europe. Why? I think it has what to do with the fact that we have a long history with China. So in a way, what they teach, maybe there's a sense that Japan's not going to be brainwashed in a way because we already know the history, and and especially in the words of one of the university administrators that have a Confucius Institute, he argues that mutual understanding is important, especially in this type of conflict. So in a way, this is more of enhancing understanding. Second, Japan's universities, this is also true to a certain extent in the US, but more so in Japan, we need more students from abroad in general for the universities to be sustainable. We have an increasing international population in Japanese universities because 18-year-old population is declining, and 40% of which right now comes from China. So in general, having a relationship with a Chinese university, that's how these Confucius Institutes work, to have a steady flow of Chinese students to Japanese universities in general is not a bad thing. So that's where things stand. I'm still doing research on this. I'm trying to do some interviews with universities that do host these. But if you try to do a search, the people who are uncomfortable tend to be more from the conservative media who are already worried about China. So it's not so much that the Confucius Institute created more fear among those who are not already worried about China. Second, there was a rumor of China takeover of Chinese intervention into the Okinawa governor election in the fall. So I try to track and because it seems like such a perfect situation where there is already antagonism towards the U.S. bases there, it makes total sense that people are worried about China, and maybe China does want to drive a wedge. But I think what I've seen so far is that the rumors of China takeover of Okinawa resorts, if the opposition win, it's more fake news than otherwise. And a lot of the things that were said about the late Governor Onaga in his connection with China was not well founded. And in terms of what happened as the outcome of the election, the opposition won, and some have argued that it actually backfired for the conservative forces to actually have more right-wing groups to propagate this view because they alienated voters from voting for the conservatives because they thought it was fake news. So in a way, that's where things stand. I think there's still a lot to be seen on this issue, but I think so far it has shown that it hasn't been really well founded that China in fact intervened in the Okinawa election. And so but there is a new development, which is research at university level. There has been, just a couple of days ago, introduction or suggestion of new regulations to stop the flow of U.S. technology to China through Japanese universities. So because they're worried that they might be a target of sanction from the U.S. if they see evidence of flow of U.S. technology to China from the U.S. So that, once again, there has been more of a worry of China through what the U.S. is worried about China's sharp power, and the threat of China's sharp power seem to be seen through the lens of what the U.S. is thinking about the issue, and that might be slightly different than other countries. So my conclusion is that, one, value diplomacy is driven not so much by China but has more deeper roots in terms of Japan's aspirations to be promoting or be a promoter of universalistic values. It's interesting to see how things might change when the U.S. itself changes its policy, as highlighted by Professor Rozman, and how that would affect Japan's position. And two, Japan's distinct understanding and approach to value diplomacy continues. There's lots of legacies of the past that we see, what we see today. And finally, this is still tentative, but the sharp power movement, sharp power, responses to China's sharp power seems to be more muted than other countries for various reasons. I'm trying still to see why it's not quite there. But part of the reason might be that strong arguments against what seems to be China's sharp power tends to come from very anti-China groups within Japan, which comes from a very conservative branch, which might be alienating groups in Japan who might inherently be worried about these actions from human rights prisoners. They don't want to be seen as being hijacked by the right wing on their agenda, so that's making it very difficult for them to be proactive on this issue. So, so that's my part. Thank you very much.
Now, one just clarification. You say university student, 40% of
foreign university students
in Japan are Chinese. Okay.
As from the data I saw last.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's terrific. Professor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Gil, for the invitation. I've learned a lot from the papers just presented and will modify mine, I think, in part, based on what I've just learned and what I learned on the plane coming over, actually reading those papers. The paper that I've presented, which is available online, assumes that Australia is currently recalibrating its relationship with China on a number of fronts. And the question it asks is, what are the implications of this for values diplomacy? That relationship is shifting from what we might consider unfettered engagement to something that's being described as bounded engagement. It's not a turning away from China. It's not a right-wing response to China's rise. It's concern about the integrity of Australian institutions and the values that underpin them, given Australia's asymmetrical dependence on China and China's inclination to use economic coercion or other means in order to achieve its objectives in the region, and Australia sees itself very much as part of the region. And in answering the question, what are the implications for values diplomacy in Australia, I adopt a simple methodology. I take 3 white papers on foreign policy published in 1997, 2003, and 2017, and trace what values meant in those papers and look at the significant variations over time. Now, there's a lot more that's happened in the relationship that would help to inflect a conversation around values. But this is one way forward, and it helps to isolate and identify some of the critical issues. The argument that I mount takes place, I guess, through 5 or 6 different steps. Let me just summarize what they are. First is to place values diplomacy in comparative perspective. Now, in my paper, that's comparing the Australian case with the American case. But I'd like now to think a little more about comparing it with the case in other countries in East Asia. Secondly, to trace how values have entered foreign policy in Australia, both through the liberal humanist traditions and, in a way, through the ODA programs, which have always had values at their heart, but then more broadly in thinking about the national interest outside of ODA, but how the national interest is pursued in relationships, in economic relationships, strategic and people-to-people ties, and looking at changes in that broader relationship outside of the ODA frame. And I find in the paper that foreign policy has sort of embraced values within the Australian context in relation to a domestic debate on values and national identity. And that's played into foreign policy in important ways. Thirdly, I point to what's new in the 2017 white paper, what is significantly new on values. Fourth, shows the catalytic role of Beijing in triggering this through its actions in the South China Sea and through what appears to be interference or sharp power in Australia. Then I go on to note the challenges of securing bipartisan support in a fractured domestic polity around values, both in relation to national identity and foreign policy. And then finally look at China's response, how it is that the Chinese government and Chinese intellectuals have long been engaged with the relationship, framing the values question in foreign policy. Let me just touch very briefly on each of these in turn by just drawing on some comments from the paper. First, the 2017 Statement on Foreign Policy is only the 3rd ever issued in Australia. There have only ever been 3. One was called In the National Interest, came in 1997. The other was Advancing the National Interest in 2003. Now, what's important here is to note all 3 have been initiated and published by conservative coalition governments, not by the liberal side of Australian politics, which is known as Labor. That's an important point to note. They've come out of the coalition or conservative side. The second point to note is this, that values have always had a place in these documents and have always had a place in policy, but it's largely confined to that little section on ODA. It's really not embedded in discussion of the national interest, security, and so on. It's how values found their way out of the ODA conversation into the broader framing of relationships that I think is critically important in the 2017 white paper. And in this respect, it seems to me that value or upholding values came to be seen as a core national interest in 2016 and 2017 in a way they had not previously. They'd been seen as just part of a general soft power push. Thirdly, that values diplomacy in Australia runs on a very different cycle, to a different rhythm, and actually means something quite different from what it does in the United States. That is, there is no direct correspondence between the conversation in Australia on values diplomacy and what's been happening in the United States, either back in, say, Nixon's time, the hard realists of Nixon, then Reagan's values diplomacy. None of that had any echo in Australia. Generally speaking, in Australia, the sense is values diplomacy are at the bilateral level, we talk national interests. At the regional level, we talk values, so to speak. You know, it's about a regional order rather than bilateral relationships. And there's a segregation in conversation, at least until 2017, between the bilateral and the multilateral level, in which values, in a sense, belonged in the multilateral, the regional or global, rather than the bilateral. Now, this causes many in Australia who work in these areas to reflect that, of course, global perspectives have always mattered in Australian foreign policy, but they've been in the background. What's happened is that they've been foregrounded by China's recent behaviour. That as a middling liberal democracy, Australia has long recognised it has a fundamental stake in the maintenance of a global rules-based order capable of ensuring what really matters to Australia: regional stability, growth and development, and being assured, I suppose, that there are diplomatic ways of resolving potential conflicts that don't undermine fundamental bilateral relationships. Now, values made their way out of ODA into the broader foreign policy frame way back in 1997, we can call that way back, by a roundabout route, which again had nothing to do with the United States. And this came out of a national values conversation to do with the so-called Asianization of Australia. And Pauline Hanson was an important contributor to this. This is a Conservative senator elected from Queensland who put race back on the table, and it hadn't been there really since the 1950s and 60s. And this led to a conversation about whether Australia is being Asianized by its migration policies and engagement with the region. And as this public debate on the Asianization of Australia developed, it merged into a wider series of discursive battles which might appear to have nothing to do with foreign policies, the history wars, the cultural wars. Obviously, these oddly enough had parallels in the United States, but they were run on on different rails in Australia related to domestic issues and policy. But in a way, the colloquial, ethnocentric language of those debates found their way into the first two foreign policy white papers. And let me just quote from the 1997 one. And this is a statement up front in that paper. The values which Australia brings to its foreign policy have been shaped by national experience, given vigour through cultural diversity, but reflecting a predominantly European cultural and intellectual heritage. Now, similar sentiments were echoed in the 2003 one. This is the standard conservative line in Australian politics, that whatever values that Australia as a politic professes relate to its European tradition. Australia is a strange outpost in this Asian region where people have other values. We have European ones, or something like that, or Judeo-Christian ones. These days, white supremacist ones. There are all sorts of ways of framing this, but it goes back fundamentally to an earlier conversation known as white Australia, and the later ethnographic sort of development or escape from that hasn't really escaped very far. So embedding values in these ethnically centred national identities and articulating them in what is, in fact, a kind of folksy language, kind of bizarre in these foreign policy white papers, means that they cannot be promoted internationally. They're very local. They seem to be local in particular. And in fact, then the foreign policy white paper, let me just quote, says, "We eschew the soapbox in favour of effective diplomatic solutions. When we talk values, we're talking about us, not you." This is where the 2017 foreign policy white paper changed. And it changed in a number of different ways. One was, I said, take values out of the ODA space and put them with the liberal values. Second, abandon that ethnocentric language or ethnocentric framework. And third, cast aside the colloquial language in which it had been framed, which could not be translated into other national or international idioms. As one commentator, Alan Gingell, has put it, values have taken on a new centrality in this new paper. They hardly counted in the 1997 one. In 2003, they're in colloquial terms, but now they're expressed emphatically and defined in classic liberal forms throughout the document, and that's important. But in fact, the white paper did more than this. As I noted earlier, it actually re-entered, in a sense, a debate about national identity politics. We have a foreign policy paper which is making a statement about identity politics. And it says here, or it abandons the language, the Western heritage language, the European heritage language that was found in early papers, and instead, and I quote, says, Australia does not define its national identity by race or religion, but by shared values. That was new to many people who read it, but it's a very important statement coming out of the foreign policy establishment back into domestic debate, showing that, I suppose, the degree to which this is an indigenously generated concern. Again, far removed from the United States, but likewise from Korea and Japan. I suppose that one of the important things that's happened at the same time is, for the first time, the Labour Party has entered into the values debate through its senator, Penny Wong. Now, Penny Wong is the Foreign Affairs spokesperson for the Labour Party and is likely to be the Foreign Affairs Minister after the next election in May this year. And she made a very, very important speech at Griffith University around the time, or just before the white paper emerged. And let me just quote from that. I don't want to go on much further than this. I quote, "It was my good fortune to have been born into a family with two values traditions, those of China and what we loosely call the West. It will not surprise you that I don't accept the view that some former Asian leaders have propounded, that values are an artifact of Western imperialism. Now, on the Australian side, that means to be values are an artifact of an ethnocentric European heritage. Values are not some kind of stalking horse behind which the West or the US seeks to assert and defend a form of political dominance, nor are they simply the legacy of what some describe as the Judeo-Christian tradition. And with this personal reflection, I think we have a very significant shift on the liberal side, paralleling the conservative side of politics, in effect challenging 2 decades of Asian and Australian conservative insistence on the Western character of universal values, and opening space for a different kind of conversation than any which has taken place in Australia to date. One founded on an ideal of equal and indivisible human dignity, and grounded in law and institutions rather than arguments for a particular cultural or religious heritage. The paper makes a few other points in addition to that. But what it does is try to, as well, translate some of these observations into a form of public diplomacy in which Australian government speaks the common language of liberal human values beyond the ODA frame in bilateral and multilateral forums. This marks this marks a very significant development. Whether it leads to significant change in practice is not yet entirely clear. China is still capable of exercising coercive influence as it is at the present time in relation to coal and barley. I mean, there are certain issues here in Canada in relation to China relations and trade. What's not being spoken about internationally, or even in Australia, because an election is coming up, is that China is currently trying to exercise influence within Australia by pressuring certain industries in agriculture and mining to force Australian governments, of whatever colour, to comply with its regional objectives. Thank you very much.
Interesting. Thank you. Mr. Huff. You have slides.
I do.
Can I move out of your way?
I think I should be able to do it.
I really thought this would be a real change in values if we had a whole panel with no slides. Some traditional values are. Yeah.
The post-slide era.
Different generation.
Yeah, too old for slides.
Something to look at for innocence.
Do you want to stand over or sit over here?
It's okay. I can do it from here. Okay, so hi, my name is Aram. I'm from NYU. Today I'm talking about North Korea's sharp power and the divide over Korean identities. And I want to start with, we've been talking about definitions of sharp power, so here's one from Walker and Ludwig. We say, informational strategies that aim to cut razor-like into the fabric of a society, stoking and amplifying existing divisions. So when we talk about sharp power more colloquially, we think of images like, Russian hacking incidents, fabrication of fake news or fake social media accounts, etc., to affect very specific outcomes. Now, what seems to be happening in that discourse is sort of this overlay of sharp power as something that is defined by malignant motive. So we've used languages like coercion, covert, etc., and soft power as one where, based on attraction, moving hearts and minds, much more benign in its motive. And what's happening here is really this confluence of the motive with regime type. Now, I think there are two kind of big problems with this. One is that any kind of power is never entirely benign. I mean, soft power is, in a sense, sort of the deepest kind of manipulation that you can do, which is, changing what these states even want, changing the preferences themselves. So that's one. And the second thing is this sort of overlay of regime type with soft versus sharp power misses, I think, a lot of important cases. So China's quote-unquote sharp power is also a form of soft power, but projected at other authoritarian regimes and that hierarchy, for example. It's not really about persuading democracies. It also misses cases of U.S. use of sharp power, for example, during the Cold War, where those type of strategies of trying to affect other countries' elections was a very common covert strategy. And so what I want to do today is really kind of shift that definition and offer a new one that focuses on sort of the locus of power. So both soft as well as hard power are about doing things through coercion or attraction, and dangling those things that are outside of the target regime. Whereas I conceptualize sharp power as a set of strategies that really aim to affect forces that are internal to the target state itself in order to kind of force its hand. And so with that definition, I think some of the questions that have been really asked is, well, then why do different states use sharp power? Right? And existing answers in the literature tend to focus on sort of structural factors, like there's a big comparative advantage, especially for authoritarian states. They have the informational resources, or even sort of the readiness of the target democracy, how porous and sort of unexpected they are of a sharp attack. Now I want to kind of revert this attention to a more of an agent-driven approach, because where's the actual state here that is inflicting sharp power? And to really say that, states, whether they're democracies or authoritarian regimes, use sharp power when they have very specific political needs that cannot be otherwise achieved through soft or hard power alone. And this really draws attention to the context of specific political conflicts that each of these states are in. And my big argument today is that that is what actually shapes the timing and form of sharpness. And that's why we see very different manifestations of sharp power, for example, in Russia versus China. And I want to illustrate this using the case of North Korean sharp power. So I want to start by thinking about, well, what are North Korea's political goals? I'm beginning in 2018. So this is right after the whole fire and fury rhetoric. North Korea has just done an unprecedented number of ballistic missile tests. And what that actually showed it, which it had known all along, is that its strong and long alliance with China, it tends to be kind of a fair weather friend, right? And it needs something that's going to protect it from growing U.S. pressure and international sanctions. And what it realizes is that now with a liberal administration in South Korea under Moon Jae-in, that South Korea offers a very important identity alliance based on something that's deeper than shared economic interests or aligned to political ideology, something that's based on a co-national identity. And so it finds itself in this kind of peculiar situation where it actually needs to get cooperation from a rival democracy that A, is technically still at war with, and B, that, over in the long term, it really does seek to undermine. Now, I said co-nationality principle there because that belief or that principle really belies a lot of the complexities of barriers within South Korea to achieving an inter-Korean alliance. This has been brought up by Professor Kim's presentation of, there's great opposition within South Korea from the conservative side So this was the side that took over right after the Korean War, saw kind of North Korea as the key threat to the spread of communism, so very staunch anti-North Korean position versus the progressives who tend to be much more pro-North Korea and anti-US and South Korea. So that's a key group of opposition to pursuing an inter-Korean alliance. The second group that is not usually talked about in this specific way are the South Korean youth. So South Koreans about between 20 to 40 years old, grew up in a very different time, sort of cooled down relations with the North. They grew up, their formative memories of North Korea are Cheonan sinking and Yongbyon shelling, where North Korea deliberately caused South Korean casualties. And there's sort of this loosening of this belief of ethnic connections to North Korea. The generation that survived the Korean War and has separated families are passing away, and this new generation doesn't have that kind of first-hand tie to North Korea anymore. In fact, only 1 in 3 in that age group now think that shared nationalism or shared ethnicity is a reason to reunify, for example. And the reason these two groups matter is that even under Moon Jae-in administration, South Korea is still a competitively elected democracy. He still has these different public groups to which he is sort of constrained by, right? So these are sort of barriers to North Korea that are internal to the South that it needs to kind of deal with if it wants to pursue an inter-Korean alliance. Now this puts North Korea in this kind of unique situation where externally, right, it needs to project sort of this image of a soft alliance with South Korea to the international community, but really specifically to the US, right? While balancing that internally with two kind of contradictory goals. Now, in the short term, it wants to do whatever it can to deal with those identity barriers within South Korea to build support for an inter-Korean alliance, but also wanting to balance that with its ultimate goal of wanting to destabilize South Korea and ultimately undermine its democratic legitimacy. Narrowly, that this specific context really shapes the form of North Korea's sharp strategy toward South Korea. And I call this a Trojan horse strategy because what North Korea seems to be doing is hijacking South Korea's most prominent soft efforts to kind of project a soft glow up towards the North and out to the international community, while then kind of exploiting that direct access to the South Korean public to gain leverage over those cleavages that I just talked about, sometimes by stoking divisions, other times by uniting them to basically force South Korea's hand by using the forces within. So I'm going to illustrate that with kind of two cases of the most prominent sharp efforts, and you're going to probably sit there thinking, well, these don't seem like sharp power cases to me, but that actually is exactly the point. So the first case I'm going to talk about is the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. Where is North Korea at this point? It just came out of the heels of Fire and Fury in 2017. It has a dire need for a strong identity alliance with South Korea. In South Korea, with the new Moon Jae-in administration, commitment is strong to pursuing that type of inter-Korean alliance, which means that it actually frees up space for North Korea to kind of, on the surface, create this alliance while underneath and continuing to stoke the usual divisions that exist in South Korea to undermine its legitimacy. How does it actually do that? Well, on the surface, it made a really big show of the Winter Olympics, right? It did the joint procession under the One Korea flag. It sent a huge cultural troupe with the famed cheerleaders and really kind of leveraged the international media attention that it was getting. While internally, it dropped kind of very sharp nuggets, and I would call these sort of narrative nuggets that kind of tweaked the usual anti-North Korean cleavages within South Korea. So even as the Moon Jae-in administration is working hard to make this joint Olympics a success, underneath a lot of stuff was going on. And the first is the joint North and South Korean hockey team. Again, this on the surface seems like a great idea, great public sort of diplomacy move. And in practice, that means that South Korean players lost their spots on the Olympic team, right? This drew nearly 450 online petitions to the Blue House, some of them racking up more than 50,000 co-signatures from citizens. And a quick sort of content analysis of sort of the main reason for each of those petitions reveals that the main reasons are sort of this politicization of the Olympics for what is sort of a progressive agenda, right? And the sort of accommodation of the North at the expense of the South. So the classic kind of thematic arguments that define really the conservative position within South Korea. The second sharp tactic I want to talk about is the use of this particular cheerleading prop. So the North Korean cheerleaders tended to use the One Korea flag for most of it, and then switched to this prop during the actual joint hockey team session, which was not very heavily covered by really international media, more heavily covered by the domestic South Korean media. And there were a lot of sort of brouhaha about, why this face. There's some uncanny similarities to Kim Il-sung's younger profile. And I want to kind of step away from whether or not this is actually true, etc. But what I do want to point out is it's really peculiar that this had such similarity to Kim Il-sung's younger profile. So this is not similar to Kim Jong-un's face or Kim Il-sung's sort of older face, but younger face. A face that's really most familiar to a certain age group in South Korea that forms the basis of the conservative support, right? So, and this prompted the reaction that you might think, this is Representative Ha Tae-kyung from the Padden Party, which is this split off from what used to be Park Geun-hye's party, saying, they think this is the Pyeongchang Olympics, right? And now, barring any direct evidence of whether this was actually the motive or not, the end result was that it's basically stoked the classic lines of identity division within South Korea, even while on the surface, Moon worked hard to make this Joint Olympics a success. The second case I want to look at is the third Inter-Korean Summit. And the reason why this is actually really interesting is that the context for North Korea has changed actually quite a bit from the Winter Olympics. So this is April, right, of 2018. The Olympics did what it was supposed to do, which is that it signaled this thawing of relations between North and South. And so the U.S. responded. This was coming off the heels of Pompeo's visit to North Korea. And the U.S. is now engaging in direct negotiations with both the North and the South. Now, in that kind of a political context, what worries the North the most is a South Korean identity alliance that might be weaker than a South Korean interest alliance with the U.S. Right? That's what it worries it most. So it wants to make sure that South Korea has these two different types of alliances, that its alliance with the North is stronger. And South Korea at this point is curbing a little bit under U.S. pressure. Right? The U.S. is saying, "Hey, slow down. You're too eager to pursue this alliance. Like, let us do our work with the sanctions, etc." So South Korea is showing signs of kind of wavering on what used to be a very kind of unilateral, strong commitment. So North Korea finds that, okay, is this time to shift to the short-term goal of really trying to build bottom-up support within South Korea for a strong inter-Korean alliance. How does it do this? So externally, again, it kind of does a lot to construct the historicity of this summit. There was nothing really special about this summit. It's the third time that it had happened, right? But then Kim Jong-un suggested that he was going to travel down to South Korean territory for the first time as a North Korean leader, and did a lot of sort of things that actually created a lot of momentum around this summit. And then internally, while he had kind of direct exposure to the South Korean public, and particularly the South Korean youth, he used a great deal of performance politics to kind of really subvert the dominant narrative of who he is, especially among youth. Brutal murder of his half brother, etc., of his uncle, to someone who's actually pretty funny, right? Easygoing. He made a few sort of key jokes when he brought the Pyongyang naengmyeon cool noodles for the summit dinner, and he said, this traveled really far, but I guess I shouldn't say that it traveled so far, right? 멀리 왔다고 하면 안 되겠구나 for the Koreans in the room. And that became kind of this meme, right? It was, cycled through sort of Korean like commercials, through a lot of the talk shows, and became kind of this unofficial theme for North and South Korean relations. We're actually not that far apart. Now you might say, well, these are spontaneous moments, but nothing about summits are spontaneous, especially summits of this high stakes. Everything is choreographed. And we're talking about third generation, a dictator of a regime that is exceptional at performance politics. Now you might say, well, okay, those are your thoughts. These things can be read many different ways. So I want to show you some concrete examples of what North Korea actually says post-summit. Right? And this is coming directly from the Nodong Shinmun, which is sort of the mouthpiece for the Workers' Party. And it's really interesting to see the language that North Korea uses post-summit, right? Anytime South Korea shows any hesitance, they use language such as, well, this is what the Minjok has unanimously hoped for and demanded. This would be a misreading of the people's will, something that they have kind of ordained by popular mandate for this inter-Korean alliance. Just using the language of democratic responsiveness, right, of public preferences, and catering to that to kind of frame any type of hesitance on the part of Moon as essentially violating a core principle of a democracy, of a competitive electoral democracy. So you can see sort of here the connection of what seems like on the surface very soft efforts and value diplomacy on the part of North Korea, but there are nuggets of narratives here that not only divide but sometimes actually unify, right, and create positive support within its target state to essentially bind the leader's hand to the outcome that it needs at the time. So this agent-driven approach to really kind of see sharp power as an internal power strategy yields, a lot of new insights into sort of the breadth and diversity, I think, of how we typically think about sharp power. And in the case of North Korea, it does provide sort of a traceable logic, because North Korea does sort of abrupt changes, especially to its relations with South Korea. There's an abrupt cooling down and then heating back up, and a lot of times experts would say, well, this is sort of irrational, etc. But this actually reveals quite a rational logic to why it might do that. And I would say that it casts kind of a more politically realist view of North Korea's recent diplomacy run, not only towards South Korea, but to other countries as well. And it generates a predictive framework for how to think about sharpness, especially from this regime. So I would, venture to say that post-Hanoi, that we probably will see sort of a rapid cooling down of its pursuit of inter-Korean alliance. It's built so much momentum so fast, and based on this framework, I would say that we're going to see a little bit of a cooling down on that front. All right, thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Aram. That was terrific. Thanks to all the panelists. I think you'll agree with me, all really excellent and provocative in a good way presentations. I have a lot of notes, but I'm mindful that we really have only about 15 minutes left. Is that right, Kyle? So maybe I'll try to read. Recite a few of the notes I made, at least the ones I can still read, because there's been so much covered. And then turn to the floor for some short interventions, questions, because I think then we'll have time only to really go back to the panel, maybe just for one kind of final comment from each. But again, thank you all for really excellent presentations. A couple of things I wrote down, this is more or less in order as I listened to your presentations, that I'd welcome some comment now or as we go forward. The description of China's, Gil, yours in particular, but everyone's use of sharp power, soft power, it seems to me like we're describing the kind of China I used to read about in the history books. China that was hesitant to use to be seen as a military power, to use military force, although it sometimes did, but was very, very skillful at projecting itself as a great civilization with enormous soft power appeal, to use what would be now an anachronistic term if we used it previously, but but also willing to use quite a bit of sharp elbows as sharp power through the centuries. So that's kind of tied to my question. It's kind of an historical question. Are we seeing China acting in a very, historically expectable way? And relatedly, is China really looking to recreate? Is Qinsha a recreation of a Chinese world order that will be peaceful and great values will prevail, Confucian values, whatever they are, international values, only with a China that regains a role which is closer to a notion of pre-Westphalian civilization than that which we've known in the past couple of centuries. I'm trying to jump down here a little bit. Back to the United States, and this is again kind of for everybody. Do these countries see this is the Trump administration and its stepping back, if you like, from traditional internationalist values that the United States has seen itself as leader on to a different set of values in some ways, although it's rather incoherent, I would say, in many ways. Do they see this as a temporary bump in the road, and there will be a return to some more traditional internationalist values, or is this something that countries are already, hedging on? And if so, what does that look like? A doubling down on those values which the U.S. has stepped away from, or an accommodation or a redefinition? I think we heard a little bit about this, that Australia, for example, is also having some of these same kinds of discussions. I'd welcome, if we had time, a little more discussion on Confucian institutes, but I appreciate what we had. I'm kind of curious, were Confucian institutes set up to be something and then have become more of an instrument of sharp power because of changes in the world environment, or was this always maybe another kind of Trojan horse? ODA, great discussion on that. I think we should have more. No one mentioned Belt and Road. But to what extent is China's Belt and Road soft or sharp, or what values underlie it? I see a big discussion on that. South Korea, Professor Kim, I appreciated your discussion, your paper, and your remarks of the THAAD. This is more your kind of a value judgment by you. Have South Korean attitudes changed towards China because of this? I've just anecdotally had South Koreans say to me, "We thought we knew China, but we don't." Is this how permanent are, or if at all, are the changes in attitudes about China? And the other question is this an example where sometimes sharp power is counterproductive? Has China lost more through its application of sharp power in South Korea than it's gained? The jury may still be out on that. With respect to Japan, many questions came to mind, but one is there any sort of discussion in Japan of the relative balance between hard power and soft power / as you say, Japan has been a leading proponent of soft power, has redefined that in a more values-oriented way. But there's also, certainly on the part of the Abe government, a sense that it's time for Japan to have a hard power capability more consistent with its own power and place in the world. How do those play together? And relatedly, do continuing, if you like, regional tensions, particularly with South Korea, but with others over the historical legacy, still inhibit, from the Japanese perspective, its choices? One thing I was prompted to think with from Professor Fitzgerald's presentation was, as you talked about, the different kind of values that we see in the, if you like, countries that have been, the United States would be one of these too, have traditionally been, if you like, Enlightenment values, Western values, European values. There's a different set under discussion now that have to do more with a more ethno-nationalist identity. It reminds me that certainly in the United States, we've often had sets of values that we define differently, obviously across the political spectrum, but also for a domestic audience, international audience. It's even so encapsulated, at least until fairly recently, in U.S. law that, for example, our outward soft power efforts, that is the efforts of U.S. diplomats, the Voice of America, U.S. Information Service, and so on, were prohibited by law from, if you like, propagandizing American citizens. just kind of ironic you would think that was propagandizing because you thought they were kind of universal values. But nonetheless, the point here is, in a world, we haven't really touched on this, we can't touch on everything, where communications are so completely globalized, whether they're the values of racism and white supremacy or the values of inclusive democracy, they are shared, instantaneously. There are no borders there. And what impact does that have on our values agenda and values diplomacy? With respect to this fascinating presentation on North Korea and South Korea, it seems to me you kind of posed the question, will kind of identity values trump, as a verb, trump, you said interests, but also values, or democratic values? And kind of the question, should South Korea sacrifice in some way, or at least make compromises on its liberal values for the sake of its national identity values? Is it easier for it to make some of those choices now, given the different approach that the Trump administration has to some of these traditional values and its approach to alliances? With respect to the Trojan horse analysis, I think that's really fascinating, and certainly the North Koreans have been very skilled in this. I would ask, how would you view, it may not happen, you say the inter-Korean may slow down for a while, but how would you view a Kim Jong-un visit to Seoul, which has been previewed, in the context of this kind of sharp power strategy? Many have thought that a North Korean leader going to Seoul would have a big impact. But I wonder what kind of impact they would see it as having, or you would see it as having as well. And finally, I guess I'd just say on the Trojan horse, I in my own sense, but I'd welcome your reaction either now or later on when we talk of South Korea to me doesn't seem like it's Troy, and I think this Trojan horse approach is a very good way of looking at it. But I, for one, if I may opinionate here now or opine, is I don't think it would work. But I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. So I've taken up too much of the time now, but I've really, as you can see, been very stimulated by these presentations. I'd welcome. Yes.
Thank you. Louise against Scotland, and I have a probability question, if you want. To what extent is sharp power actually our own strategic narrative? How different is sharp power from influence operations or, say, propaganda? It's us labeling China a particular way we don't want China to operate as we perhaps did in the past.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, David Cameron from Sciences Po in Paris and Vietnam National University. And my comment is part of my Euro-Asian schizophrenia to suggest that papers, fascinating papers, but the examination of sharp power could, I think, benefit from looking at the European discussion of normative power, which is a kind of the dominant trope in a lot of IR discussion of European power, normative power. I have doubts about it. I prefer the expression market power, but and the second point is another kind of expansion, not conceptual but geographical. The panel was concerned about the Indo-Pacific. The notion of Indo-Pacific is promoted first by the Indonesians, Martin Takako in 2013, actually going back to Muhammad Hatta, maybe in the 1950s. And I wonder if given Korean interest and Japanese interest in Southeast Asia, that shifting our focus further south would benefit, in fact, in giving a bit more, perhaps, depth to the discussion.
Yeah.
Especially as a country like Indonesia would be claiming that it's trying to invent this notion of Indo-Pacific, which has a civilizational aspect to it.
Great points. Final one, yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ben Silverstein. I'm from University of Pennsylvania. I have a question on the issue of values domestically versus internationally. It strikes me that both, so just to example, both China and North Korea are countries that are in many ways guided by Confucian values, but for North Korea, this it seems like domestically within the system, Confucian values matter quite a lot. But then internationally, they reject the notion that they don't want to just recognize the power of the mandate of heaven of the larger country of China, and they really reject the notion that they, as a small state, should be subservient So I wonder how do countries in East Asia, are they able to use one set of, or be so heavily influenced by one set of values domestically, but then internationally or outwardly it just doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah, terrific. All right, sorry with my poor time management, but I'm going to just go down the row again and ask everyone to comment on as many any or all of this that you can within about 1 to 2 minutes each.
Okay, I begin, and Kathy, you've asked great questions, and each one I think is worth a lot of thought, and I hope we will follow up, because we're preparing these papers for publication in a KEI volume, and Kyle is deeply involved in that, and we will go through these questions with the authors and see if we can get more. I would say I agree that Chinese history has a lot of parallels. I think John and I know each other initially as people who writing about Chinese history, and I welcome his thoughts. My own view is that there is an effort to reestablish at least a Chinese regional order on principles that go back quite a ways, not necessarily to earlier Chinese history, but to the way China was transformed by foreign dynasties under the Yuan and the Qing, and then there was also the Ming authoritarian tendencies, and so I think there's something really here to explore further. And I also think that I'm curious to what the Trump impact is on what people see of the U.S. future. My own view is that there's still the jury is out, but there is a tendency now to look at the U.S. and say the U.S. will never be the same again. I'm seeing that from many sides, and I personally don't know how much that shift is going to take place. And I do think that the Confucian Institutes have changed over time with changes in Chinese leadership, so that they probably were a Trojan horse to begin with, because I don't see Xi Jinping as a fundamental shift to the way China was moving quite a bit earlier. But even so, I think a big shift occurs in 2008, 2009, but even some of that can be anticipated. So I would guess that the implications of where China was going were already well set, and the Confucian Institutes would have moved in a similar direction, even with other leadership. I'll stop my comments there.
Well, so many good comments and questions. First of all, I think that to your question, China is really trying to intend to recreate the Qianxia order. I don't think so, and I don't think it's possible in the coming years. But then, one thing for sure for me is that China is trying to extract some values in the whole system of Qianxia. And I some experts, including myself, they spot some some traces of Qianxia notion in Chinese diplomatic rhetoric. Say, for example, the common community of common destiny, the inclusion sort of things. Okay? So I think they're working actually very hard on the system of Qianxia underneath the surface at the moment. Probably in the coming years, they would bring up some, very, fancy and attractive values dug out from Qianxia notion. Second point, South Korea's changes of attitude toward China. Oh yeah, including myself. I was really disappointed. I mean, the third dispute, it appears to me it's a critical juncture in South Korea's perception of China. Okay, why? Particularly, just in a couple of months, the previous Park Geun-hye regime, we actually was in the heaven, and to find out next morning ourselves in the hell. Okay, the Korea-China relationship from a highest point to the lowest pit, bottomless pit. Yeah. So many Korean people, not only Korean mass people, but also politicians, they're really, literally shocked. So they're more cautious about China these days, and particularly when this is combined with the increasingly assertive behavior under the President Xi Jinping. Okay? So this is quite different between, from the previous nationalistic dispute between Korea and China. So, yeah. The difference between propaganda versus sharp power, there's so many. But then propaganda, I would argue that propaganda is rather monolithic communication. Monologic communication. But then sharp power, just like I emphasize the fact that it's really blurry. There's a distinction between sharp and soft power. Just like soft power, sharp power is really targeting and engaging people. Yeah. So in that sense, it's more like a reciprocal in building relationship, and even collaborative. So in that sense, I think it's quite different from the notion of propaganda. I should stop it.
Thanks for all the questions. Let me just respond to two of them. One is the soft versus hard power question. I never really thought that Japan was that good about soft power. That I think there was a sort of a different notion of what soft power is, being like Hello Kitty is really popular type of thing. And I don't really see that. So I don't really see that catching up. I think what's happening right now is to be an effort to be more explicit about what Japan is trying to do in the region. Not really to catch up with the hard power, because it's not like hard power is really ratcheting up that much speed, but why not be more explicit? So in a way, the value diplomacy, I think, could be, like just going back to that, can be inherent value and then implicit, explicit, and promote. And I think we're at a stage, there's different discussions of whether it's a good thing or not for Japan, but they're being more explicit to show what Japan's trying to do in the region than before. And that's what we see. So in a way, it's not soft power and it's more explicit, but the intentions, let's be more clear about what the intentions are to explain what Japan is doing and not doing with regards to hard power. I kind of see it that way. So I don't really see the hard power part catching up. And secondly, with regards to US, another type of like papers or speaking engagements I've been doing is about whether Japan's stepping up with the understanding that US is leaving the liberal international order. I would say that yes and no. Yes, in a sense that if you understand the values part, I in my value diplomacy working definition, I said there's both the international order aspect and the domestic arrangement aspect of it. I think there is an understanding that Japan is trying to step up for the international order or international institutions part of it, which is going along like promoting TPP without the U.S. type of thing and trying to do multilateral stuff that the U.S. is not doing. But I think that Japan has a very different approach for the internal, and I think that shows in terms of what Japan's position has been in this value diplomacy thing too. That is more a reflection of what Japan has been doing in the past, and I think it's due to both the historical and reasons that restrict Japan's choices due to its history is still there, but also because of the different thinking about what's best for the country. And I think that is sort of slightly different from the US, and that hasn't really changed. And so in a way, Japan doesn't really want to make countries in Asia make choices between the US and between China and US/Japan. Japan wants to be Japan and not to be the surrogate of US in the region. I think Japan's very clear in free and open Indo-Pacific, which I've talked to people about this. They say there's a strategic ambiguity to it. And I think it's basically a repackaging of what's already happening, as I said. But in a way, the takeaway could be slightly different. And they're kind of enjoying the fact that the takeaways are slightly different. But one takeaway they don't want is that this is something that is supposed to be the U.S. is back instead of, the Japan is back instead of the U.S. It's a different kind of approach than what the U.S. might have had in the region.
Great questions. I'd just like to touch on two of them, partly because I think they're more easily answered. I'm going to avoid the difficult ones. The first is the distinction between domestic and international projections of values or embracing of values. All I'd like to say on that is, from the Australian case, that a values diplomacy which is not embedded in a local idiom, in a language which makes sense to the people of the state promoting them, will not succeed. And I think one of the problems with Australian values diplomacy in the past is where it has projected liberal values through its ODA, it's not really sought to reconcile those with contradictions at home around race and ethnicity in particular, treatment of indigenous peoples and so on. Unless, I'm not just talking about hypocrisy here, I'm talking about embracing those values in a local idiom such that they can be implemented. And I think that's the challenge in many countries. It's really around communication. The second one too goes to communication. This is, in a sense, the relativist claim, goes to the relativist claim that what China's doing with its sharp power is what liberal democracies do with their soft power. Well, certainly China is projecting its understanding of its values internationally, one way or another. What it's doing, it seems to me, is behaving internationally as it does at home, just as a liberal democracy does. But the way China behaves at home is as a Leninist party state. This means propaganda is not just information, it's a system for controlling information. At the level of the firm, if we think of strategic communications, everyone's on point, anyone speaking out of line, you're out of the firm. This is what happens in China. When this sharp power, or this China's version of soft power, goes overseas, it doesn't just seek to tell its story, it seeks to take over the communications mechanisms for telling stories. It takes over Chinese community media and kicks people out if they don't comply with this consistent message. It takes over community organizations and then mobilizes them to protest about the South China Sea. And anybody who doesn't agree is kicked out of the organization. So it's not just about the message. In a way, it's about the system for controlling information and disciplining what is said. And China does that internationally just as it does at home. And it says, what's the problem? Works here, why can't it work there? Well, it looks sharp where I'm sitting. That's because that's not how it works in a liberal democracy. If you want to actually promote those values here, you need to speak in the local idiom, again, around values.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Is South Korea Troy? Certainly not at the elite level, but I actually do think increasingly so, sort of in the ordinary citizen level, because of the generational shift. Not just that, the older generation is passing away, but more the formative experiences of the younger generation are just so different when it comes to North Korea, and that combined with the huge demographic shift that South Korea and Japan and are going through with the low birth rates, their kind of time horizons about thinking about this stuff is quite different from what the older generation and how they used to think about inter-Korean alliance and the long-term benefits, etc. So I do think increasingly so at the sort of ordinary citizen level, I entirely agree with what you said about the congruency between domestic and international values. But to your point about Confucianism, I mean, each East Asian democracy and regime has adopted those principles in ways that benefit their regime. And in the North Korean case, it's taken the foundational, really, construct of Confucianism, which is this family unit, and has projected that towards the ethno-nationalist state. So it doesn't contradict at all in the way that it sort of, cozies, but then dislinks itself from China. It's not actually contradicting it at all, because as the mother of the people in North Korea, its primary duty is to protect its children, right? So I think in that sense, it's very much in line with domestic and international principles.
Well, I wish we had more time, but I look forward to the book and the papers. KEI has another panel this afternoon that Gil's going to moderate at 4:45. No,
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
4
4 o'clock. Thank you all for your attention. Please join me in thanking this really excellent panel for their talk, their comments today and the papers to come. Thank you.